Good morning on this 11th day of October. Unfortunately, COVID has raised its head again, and we have had an incident, some exposure here at Emmanuel. And so out of an abundance of caution, this week we are not having in-person service, but we are coming to you just on this video. And thanks to the magic of a Zoom camera, my cameraman is nicely, safely distanced from myself there. Hopefully, we will meet back in person next weekend. Now, let us continue with our service, with the reading of the Gospel. The Gospel according to Matthew. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Please bow your hearts with me in prayer. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Good morning, or afternoon, or night, or whatever time it may be when you are watching this video. Today our gospel was the final parable in a trilogy of parables that Jesus told in his confrontation with the chief priests and the elders. And it really is a trilogy that Jesus threw at them. And because we are not hearing them all in one setting, we have broken them up over the last several weeks, we're going to take a moment to do a previously on for our gospel. The setting here is on the Monday of Holy Week. Yesterday on Sunday, Jesus did the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and then he went and he cleansed the temple. And then this Monday morning, Jesus has come back to the temple, and he is teaching in it. He has claimed the temple space as his own. And so the chief priests and the elders came to Jesus and attempted to discredit him. But Jesus turned the table on them and then launched into 3 parables. The first of these parables we heard 2 weeks ago. And it basically boiled down to that your actions matter more than your words. We can claim to follow God. We can claim to do God's will. But if our actions don't show anything, then our claims are meaningless. I can claim to be the best gardener in the world, but if I never grow anything, then how valid is my claim? Now, last week's parable kind of defined what those actions look like. Right? They told us what those actions are supposed to be, what they're supposed to look like. We are told that our actions are to produce fruits for the kingdom. And when we looked to Isaiah, we saw what those fruits are supposed to look like. We are supposed to produce fruits of righteousness, fruits of justice. Our work is not done selfishly. Our work is not done for ourselves. We do this work for others. We bear this fruit for others. And that fruit metaphor that we find throughout the Bible is very appropriate. The tree does not grow an apple for itself. The vine gets no benefit from the grapes that it grows, but others do. And now we come to today's gospel. It's the last of this trilogy. Jesus has been building up to it with these previous ones. And today we see him indulging in some over-the-top imagery in this parable he tells. And if we get too caught up in that over-the-top, too big imagery, and those over-the-top situations he's throwing in there, then we can miss the messages and the warnings that are in today's parable. See, this parable is filled with grace. It is filled with choices and consequences. We have a king who's inviting people to the feast. And in fact, multiple times he sends out his servants to invite people. He is sending out invitations constantly. This is like grace. Grace is always being extended to us. We can reject that invitation as many times as we want, but it's always there. Grace is always being extended to us. It is always there waiting for us. And notice what the king says there right in the middle of the parable. Basically, none are worthy. So go out and invite everybody. Right? The servants went out and invited everybody, both good and bad. See, we are not worthy of grace. It is not something we can earn. But everybody, both good and bad, are invited in. Grace is extended to everybody. And we have also been granted the ability to make choices in our lives. We can choose to follow God, or we can reject God. We can refuse to do God's work. We can refuse to produce fruit for the kingdom. Now, often this rejection is more of a kind of a passive rejection. We don't outright say, oh, just go away, God. But God starts to fall and to slip on our list of priorities. We start putting earthly matters before God. I have my farm or my business that we put above God. We elevate these earthly concerns, these earthly desires over God. And so God keeps slipping on our priority list. God's work, justice, righteousness keeps slipping lower and lower on our priority list. Now, I will admit that there does seem to be some judgment and punishment in this text. Violence is done, and it is answered with violence. But remember, Jesus is using some over-the-top language, some over-the-top imagery here. And we also need to remember that sometimes punishment is simply a result of our own actions. Oversimplified, if I stick my finger in a light socket and flip the switch, I am going to get hurt. But was that a punishment or the results of my actions? Last week we saw the crowd with Jesus accepting that violence is to be answered with violence, that bloodshed demands bloodshed. And if we participate in those systems that are violent, oppressive, and discriminatory, should we then be surprised when we encounter violence and oppression and discrimination in our society? Jesus himself has warned us, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. In other words, our actions have consequences. If we choose sin, if we put earthly things above God, if we reject the offer of grace, then we will find ourselves, through our own actions or inactions, in the darkness. But if we choose to make God a priority, if we choose to work in the vineyard, if we work to bear the fruit for the kingdom, we will then see the fruit of our labor. We will see justice and righteousness. And through God's grace, which we do not earn, which we are entirely unworthy of, we will be at the wedding feast with our King. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.